I'm Oscar Villalon. I'm the managing editor of ZYZZYVA, which is a San Francisco literary magazine established in 1985, and one of the publications that had the pleasure of publishing some of Mauro's work. Let me just then do the introduction. Most of you probably already know about Mauro, but for those of you who don't, Mauro Javier Cardenas is the author of The Revolutionaries Try Again. Harper's Magazine has described it as a high-octane, high-modernist debut novel from the gifted, fleet Mauro Javier Cardenas. In its starred review, Publishers Weekly said of our author tonight, he dizzyingly leaps from character to character, from street protests to swanky soirees, and from lengthy, uninterrupted interior monologues to rapid-fire dialogues and freewheeling satirical radio programs, resulting in extended passages of brilliance. Right. And not to be outdone, Booklist and its upcoming review will say that our author tonight has created a new language. So, with that, I'm delighted to talk to Mauro about his remarkable book. Mauro, thank you. This is lovely. This book is how many years in the writing?
So it's 14, but I took out 2 years just because I was young, and so 12.
Right, so 12 years. Now, so before we get in, just briefly some context. And this is really a quick and sort of flat summation. The action of the novel as such revolves around Antonio, who lives in San Francisco, who returns to Ecuador, which also happens to be where you're originally from, to help an old school friend he hasn't seen in many years with the presidential election. From there, a torrent of memories is unleashed, and the past and present lives of Antonio and his friends and family are examined. So what I wanted to do first was I wanted to talk about the era in which this all takes place. So first of all, what years are we talking about, and what is the political climate like in Ecuador at the time?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, because the timing is a little bit scrambled. So if you were to look at Ecuadorian history, the novel takes place between the 70s, where we had the first Ecuadorian president that was popularly elected, Jaime Roldos Aguilera, who was this guy with really big glasses, really nerdy looking, and very young. And if you go on YouTube, you can actually find a video where like the commentators are saying like, the lines for voting, the women they're much longer than the men, and it's like, and I think they hypothesize it because he's good looking. Anyway, so that was like in the 70s, and he tragically dies, as it seems to be like all young sort of loved political figures die. He died very soon after mysterious plane accident that some had blame on the CIA and others. So that's kind of the beginning. And it ends with the 1996, the election of El Loco Bucaram, who actually is on Twitter.
And who is he?
He is this guy. It's a little convoluted, but it's kind of funny. He is the stepson of Jaime Roldos Aguilera, who's the very popular guy. So after he died, he founded a political party called El Partido Rodosista Ecuatoriano, El PRE. It just so happened that he had a different take on things, and he was, very corrupt, and his family was very well known for, taking money out of the country in sacks. And we heard the stories, of course, all throughout. And he ran for president 3 times. And this is probably wrong, so you can probably fact check me, but like every time he would run, he would lose, and then he would escape the country because there were like charges against him, that he had defrauded the country. And he was major at some point, and I don't think he lasted very long there, but his whole gig was like, I am the fuerza de pobres. I'm the force of the poor. I'm a symbol of change, and the oligarchs like the enemy, and so on, right? So it takes place. So it's 96 is the end, and then the 70s is kind of the beginning. And then in between, there's a time period where León Férez Cordero, who I think in the novel is called Mini Reagan, he's part of it as well. So
why is he called Mini Reagan?
There's pictures of him, hanging out with Reagan, and there's actually the Secret Service of Reagan gave him as a gift a gun, and it's a gun that he used. There's a picture of him with him carrying it here in his waist. He would carry around, and he was kind of the macho man kind of idea of a right wing president. And at the time, because we're not very wise, we all loved him.
So, so in this climate, the book looks at Antonio and his friends, Leopoldo, Fusando, and you see them coming of age. We see them going to high school, and just kind of basically being boys, encountering various different characters and different people from basically different strata of Ecuadorian society. And the thing about it that struck me is that you do, I thought, a masterful job of conveying what it's like to live in that sort of society where corruption and inequality is a given. You just accept it. And what I was wondering is, at the time while you were writing this, were you ever taken aback by just how cavalierly, you looked at things like, dire poverty, or the fact that, one has, servants because they're just so desperately poor and they need work, even though, you're a middle class house, not as if though you're rich, but you just, the gulf is such that you can afford their labor. It's that cheap.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with just living in the world we live in, where we're here, we're hanging out, and we're having a good time, having a beer, and we're chatting, and at the same time things are happening in other places that are horrible, not too far away from us. The same thing in the book, where you have to kind of maneuver all those things at the same time. So when I was growing up in high school, it was almost like a joke. Like whenever one of my classmates' parents started working for the government, we all knew, we'd look at our watch and be like, all right, let's see how long until things change. And then 6 months into it, the guy would come in with a new car. The guy who used to take the bus would come in with a new car, and then he would have a party, and then we would all go to his humongous house and drink for free and then party. There was that. And at the same time, some of us were part of a volunteer group that we will go to the poor areas and do catechism, right? And we were taught that, being Catholic and Jesuits, that it was our role to help, and it was our responsibility to try to change things, right? And then you have more and more sort of linkages of corruption, and then at the same time, a society that's a high school that is ingrains in you that you must be the force of change as well.
Right. Again, the reason I bring it up is my own experiences visiting family in Mexico was always punctuated by that, by realizing, coming into, start, I guess, as an American, but then always being, I guess, slightly appalled by just how, my relatives, didn't blink at the fact that, there's children begging. They didn't blink at, basically, corruption. That was just a given, that, people were going to, line their pockets. And I thought, there's this wonderful thing you do in the novel where you capture what that's like. It's not exactly apathy, so much as it is trying to navigate that, because the fact of the matter is, and I mean this is becomes one of the concerns of the book. How do you change that without great bodily harm to yourself? This is not this is not simply as simple as standing outside with a clipboard and gathering petitions.
Right. No, and I think, I mean, the whole, question of what does it take for us to change anything, right? And in the novel, the characters, have all good intentions, and they love thinking of themselves as forces of change, even though they don't do anything. And it's the fact that they have the whole uncertain memories. It's almost like they see themselves in these memories where they're good people and they're doing things that are good, and that is enough for them not to do anything. And it was that the fact that we can create this mechanism for ourselves that allow us to kind of exempt ourselves from doing things.
Right. I can actually talk about the politics with you for deep into the night, but I'm not going to do that. I want to move on to something which, and I hope this is not what Booklist meant by they said you created a new language, because that would be Spanish otherwise.
The book is in Spanish.
Yeah. That would be terrible. But at least two of the chapters in the book are almost completely written in Spanish. And what was the decision behind that?
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for asking that question. A few ways I can answer that. So, when I wrote the first draft of the book, one of the rules was no rules. Write whatever comes, and develop rules after. Right. I wanted things to develop organically. Of course, there are chapters where there's all kinds of complicated rules and whatever. But so in the first chapter, when Leopoldo is calling his grandmother, it was so natural for the answer machine to be in Spanish, and for the answer machine to be an old lady like being pissed. It's like no estoy aquí, si no dejo mensaje no me importa. Like if you're calling me, I'm not here, I don't care, right? It's like an angry kind of message in Spanish that just came very natural. So I left it there in the first chapter, which is mostly in English. And then years went by, and I aged terribly, and I had children who were beautiful, and they're here. And time passed, and the time came to write these two very short chapters about the grandmothers who are trying to give Leopoldo and Antonio advice. And I wrote it in English at first, and my folks in the writing group, who some over here, read it, and they were like, "This is terrible." And then I said, well, I didn't know how to go about it. So then I remember that I'd written this first chapter where there was an answering machine in Spanish by one of the grandmothers. So I said, well, I'm going to write it in Spanish. But then I thought, well, I want to write it in Spanish that is untranslatable, right? And I wanted to write it in that way. And of course, it's not possible to write an untranslatable Spanish because there's pronouns and he and she. I mean, so it's not possible. But that was the intent. And then that also fed this notion that to me is really important. That and I'd spoken about this before. That English and Spanish, of course, in the United States, especially now. Or actually, not especially now. It's been around forever. That the relationship between Spanish and English, it's full of political implications, and you often hear people saying speak English, and to me that's really offensive in many ways because as the history of the United States with the relationship with Spanish-speaking countries is horrifying, and the way that the United States has intervened in countries where Spanish is spoken. In fact, somebody in the novel says people who adore Reagan should not be allowed into countries where Spanish is spoken because there is a relationship, and of course the relationship with Mexico, Central America, and so on. And so that became another point where just me being a 15-year-old boy thinking I hope that somebody who believes that you should only speak English reads this novel and gets upset that the chapter is Spanish. What is this?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. Two things. You're right about the Reagan thing. That's weird, and that's so weird. But when he died, I'll just say this because I had a beer. When he died, my father called me up, and he rarely does that. And he called me up, and I picked up the phone. There was no cell phones, and at least I didn't have one. And I picked it up, and I said, "Oh, hello," and it's just my dad. And he said, "That son of a bitch is dead." And, oh, Reagan, yes. So there's something there. And the second one, I remember, if you all read All the Pretty Horses, there is a portion in that beginning. There's pages that are just in Spanish. When McCarthy does the same sort of thing, and to me that's always been an acknowledgement, sort of saying, look, if you really are going to avail yourself of literature in the Americas, specifically U.S. literature, Spanish is going to be part of that. There's no reason to think that should not be excluded. In fact, that should be welcome. Look, if the lead singer from Sublime could do an entire song in Spanish, and at which point even admonishes people in that song, you should learn Spanish. And Bradley got rest in peace, was white as hell. That's something. I think that's something that to acknowledge. I also want to say quickly too about the book. I was thinking about this in terms of where does this fit? One is want to categorize. Where would you put this? Where would you put that? And it struck me as being a very American book. Even though yes, it's of the Americas and yes, it refers to a lot of stuff, but a U.S. a U.S. book. And the thing about that was that reading it, and I don't want to overstate this, and I don't want to make, a sort of a fulsome comparison, but I thought, this is what it must have been like to read Ulysses the first time and get most of the references. And as to say, as a Mexican American, go, oh yeah, Chapulín Colorado, oh yeah, Luis Miguel, oh yeah, all that stuff, like, know that, know Chante, know that, all these sort of stuff, get the references to, South American politics, to get all those sort of things that, maybe other people are going to have to, I guess, have to ask to get footnoted. Writing it, did you perceive it in any sort of terms like that, or just want to get the book done?
That's a great question again. I mean, I think, and the reason is that, again, like, I wasn't thinking about like, when I was writing, I wasn't thinking about like, okay, what are people gonna think and all that. I was just like, okay, here's what flows through my head. And the goal is to try to find the textual means for me to capture in an interesting way the things that flow through. But at the same time, again, the whole reference thing is very political, right? Because, and this happened to be the first person that edited a chapter for a magazine where he was like, I want to italicize all your Spanish. And I was like, no, you're not going to. And we went back and forth. And finally, actually, I've had to like drop Juno Diaz's name, who I don't know him, but I was just like, well, Juno did it, and then that stopped. But it was the notion that references and things that are part of our, there's an assumption that certain references are part of the culture and everybody should know them, and it's not true, right? I mean, there are references that I'm not going to know, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not knowing, and I love to think that there are Latin Americans that live here, like yourself and others, that like will read it and we'll get a lot of the references, and most of them, like the whole Chanfle thing, right? Like you have to have grown up or known that there was this show that everybody in Latin America is watching. Everybody, Mexico, Ecuador, like everybody knows in Chapulín Colorado, right? And that to me was like, there's so many of us here, and I know you guys are gonna get it.
There's millions of us.
Millions.
And I'm embarrassed.
Buy the book, millions.
Yeah. And I'm embarrassed to say I got all the Manula references too. I think there's a line in there when you say she's gonna get on Ricky Martin's motorcycle. Well, oh my gosh! That's
a video with that.
Yes. That song is an earworm. Don't look it up on YouTube. It'll stay with you, like in a Charles in Charge kind of way. You know what? So let me. So we're gonna keep this tight because we have a wonderful thing coming up, the performance. I'll open up briefly right now for questions. Does anybody have a question for Mauro? It could be about anything. Doesn't even have to be about the book.
In English or Spanish?
Or Spanish. Because otherwise I can ask him other things. I have notes. I can go and do that. All right, well that's fine. Good. Then I'll ask you something else. So how do you go, you got your degree in economics from Stanford. So how does one go from that to being a published novelist?
Right. Wow. So let me simplify. Not that this is in any way autobiographical, right? But I came to the United States thinking that I wanted to eventually go back to Ecuador and be involved in politics. And there were a few ideas I had at the time. I was obviously very young and I didn't know anything. But one of the presidents that we all liked, the one I mentioned earlier, was an engineer. So I was like, oh, I'll be an engineer, or I'll be an economist, or whatever. And then I'll go back to Ecuador. And, somewhere in my junior year at Stanford, I realized that, I think after I got a B- in macroeconomics, I realized that maybe this wasn't for me. And at the same time, I think, I discovered Borges and, Notes from Underground. And it was more a discovery of like, oh, there's more to life than wanting this one thing. And I don't know anything else.
But discovered how? Because I read an interview where you were saying you had no ambitions as a young person. As a kid, you weren't saying like, I want to grow up and be a writer.
Absolutely not. And it wasn't like in college, like, I read Borges and I was like, I must become a writer. No, it wasn't like that. It was simply like, it was more a realization in college that and I'm sure it's very common, like where you're like, well, the thing that I wanted to do was not really what I want to do, but I don't know what else I want to do. And by the way, I'm in financial aid, and I have to graduate because I can't stay another year here. And so econ was the one that had the least requirements to graduate. So I was like, all right, I'm going to graduate and do econ. And after I graduated, it was basically taking all kinds of courses. I was like, at first I was like, well, maybe I'll be a therapist like my mother, who's here. So I tried that, and and then I took some courses, on literature, and then I took some courses in writing, and then I took piano lessons. I took piano lessons for, this is not a joke. At the time, there was in the news, there was this Japanese man who was a school teacher, and it was said that he would play on the side. That wasn't his thing, but he won like the Chopin medal. And so I was like, well, if that guy can do it, I can do it. And so I was 21, and I didn't grow up listening to classical music at all.
No.
So I was like, well,
I would just held you back.
Yeah. I would just, and I used to have a folder it said like, Mauro's piano career, and my piano teacher, this French woman called Annie Lesney, who's wonderful. She would see my folder and laugh. But it took me like 4 or 5 years to realize that like, okay, now I know what music is, and I'm not it, right? And then eventually it was like, okay, well, I'll try writing and see what happens, right?
And you did all right.
Sure.
I think, yeah, you meant it in your language, for God's sake, Mauro. I mean, that's pretty good. Any questions? Because if we don't, then what I'm going to do is then turn it over so y'all can see. Yes, thank you.
I hear that the novel is already being translated into Spanish.
We hear the novel's already being translated to Spanish.
And I have 2 questions. One is, will you or have you written a novel in Spanish? Or did you consider writing this in Spanish? If not, why in English? And then the second question is, how involved will you be with the translation?
So, have you written anything in Spanish? Why didn't you write this whole thing in Spanish? And then, how involved will you be with the translation?
Right. The first question on the Spanish, it's been way too many years, but I think I remember like the seed of the effort was that I tried writing in Spanish, but the Spanish that I knew was the Spanish of high school, which is very slangy. It's very much about making fun of your friends and your friends making fun of you back, right? And that's what we call love, but we didn't call it love, but that was our way of relating to one another. And so you can't really write a novel like that. In fact, actually, that's not true, you can't. There's a novel called La Biblia Vaquera that's written in this kind of language. In fact, you can even argue that some of Sala's sentences are kind of very slangy, and although it's a little different. But, so then that didn't really appeal to me because it was just very limited. At the time, again, I was very young and silly and all that. I was very much enamored with Nabokov and the idea of Nabokov, even though I didn't understand half of his short stories. I had no idea what they were about, but I loved the language. So that was kind of, I think, the decision-making process for the English. And the other thing is that the beautiful thing about English for me at the time was that I felt that it was that had a lot more freedom than in Spanish, because words that you guys that grew up with English, where certain words like love, house, car, beer, whatever, have kind of a tree of associations, right? That you associate with moments, right? Consciously or unconsciously. That I didn't have that, right? And that I could use whatever word I wanted and pick the sequence based on sound. Obviously, the meaning had to be there, but not be constrained as much, right? Where you can approach language as a system in a way. So that was that. The question about translation. So it hasn't been translated yet. In fact, in the next few weeks we're gonna talk about how we're gonna go about it. What we're likely gonna do, we're gonna have 4 or 5 translators. We're gonna ask for samples of certain chapters. Some of the chapters are a little more slangy, and some of the chapters they asked me to translate it, and the reason why I said no is because I think Sable says in one of his interviews, like they ask him, you know English very well. Why don't you translate from German to English? And what he said was, well, I can see the death in the horizon, and I want to just finish writing my novels. And literally, he died soon after that. So I do see death in the horizon as well, and I want to write my novels. That being said, it's going to be, unless you get somebody from Guayaquil to translate the novel, there are going to be some things that I'm not going to be happy about. So, in my mind, ideally, the translator will do most of the book, right? But the parts where people are talking, especially when the boys are talking to one another, these are men, but you can call them boys, I probably want to slang it. And I'm probably going to want to use the language of Guayaquil, because I do want the novel in Spanish to have the Ecuadorian language, to have the slang that I grew up with. And by the way, I did try, like a few years ago, to write a very short novel about the language of Guayaquil, where it was just like one sentence per word. It was like, oh, this word meant blah, 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 blah. And it was terrible. So I won't try that again for a few years.
Right. So,
will the Spanish chapters be in English? Will you insist on that?
will you inverse them?
I will not.
Okay. All right. So with that, I just want to say, Mauro, indeed, all the reviews and the praise is well deserved. It's a wonderful novel. And now let's turn it over to the folks from Word for Word. If you're all ready, come on up. Yeah, please, you should applaud.